Hello and welcome to our video summarizing all you need to know about Richard II, a play by William Shakespeare. My name is Sarah, and in this video we'll look at the play specifically beginning with a plot summary. We'll then examine the necessary information you need to know before looking at each character in depth, key themes as well as important symbols. This video is very useful, especially if you're studying Richard II as part of your English coursework or exam, as I'll get into the details you need to know to get top marks. So let's get started. First, an overview. The Life and Death of King Richard II is a history play by William Shakespeare believed to have been written in approximately 1595. It is based on the life of King Richard II of England, who ruled between 1377 until 1399, and is the first part of a tetralogy. Onto the plot summary. The play opens in King Richard's court, as Henry Bolingbroke, son of Gaunt, challenges Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. Henry accuses Mowbray of being involved in the recent death of the king's uncle. Richard gives in to their demands to work out their differences in one-on-one combat at Coventry. As the tournament begins, the uncertain and impulsive Richard stops the contest. Instead, Richard chooses to exile both Henry and Mowbray. He banishes Mowbray for life, and, responding for Henry's father Lancaster's pleas, he limits Henry's exile to 6 years. In line with his customary behavior, Richard is misled by his friend into poor government of the country. Henry's father, Gaunt, dies, finally broken by his son's banishment and by the state of the kingdom under Richard's rule. Richard takes possession of Gaunt's land and money. It turns out that he has also been leasing out royal land. Both of these monetary acquisitions have helped him to fund wars with Ireland. His nobles are dismayed, not only because of the waste of the kingdom's money, but also for fear over the security of their own estates. To make matters worse, Richard leaves on an expedition to Ireland. When Henry hears that his father has died and that Richard took his inheritance, he returns from exile with an invading army. The commoners and nobles are already critical of Richard. They welcome Henry in the north, led by the powerful Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. Henry marches through England, gathering his willing forces. Richard arrives back after the Irish War to find that his Welsh allies have dispersed. Furthermore, his cousin, Duke of York, unable to prevent Henry's triumphant return, has joined him instead. Some more of Richard's friends have also betrayed the king's cause. Others have been executed on Henry's orders. After taking refuge at Flint Castle, Richard surrenders and agrees to go to London, where the lords will decide what should happen next. In view of the insurrections against him, King Richard is persuaded to step down in favor of Henry Bolingbroke, now King Henry IV. Richard hands over his crown in a ceremony. Henry subsequently imprisons him in Pontefract Castle. Richard's queen is sent home to France. Some lords join in a plot against Henry, but York, the father of one of the nobles, relates their machinations to Henry. Henry spares the son of York, but he is now aware of his tenuous position as king. Henry implies to Hexton that he would like to be rid of his threats, and Hexton then murders Richard. He brings the body to London. Henry claims innocence, blaming Hexton for misunderstanding his intention. The play ends as King Henry banishes Hexton, orders a funeral for Richard, and swears to make reparation for his cousin's death by going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now onto a detailed summary, scene by scene. Act 1, Scene 1. As the play opens, the young King Richard II has just arrived at Windsor Castle, a royal headquarters near London. There he is to arbitrate a dispute between two noble courtiers, one of whom has accused the other of treachery. The accuser is the king's cousin, a proud young nobleman named Henry Bolingbroke, also called the Duke of Hereford. He is the son of John of Gaunt, the king's aged and distinguished uncle. Bolingbroke is accusing Thomas Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, of several heinous crimes against his king and country. These crimes include embezzlement, general participation in conspiracy against the king for the past 18 years, and by far the most serious, Mowbray's participation in the successful conspiracy to murder another of the king's uncle a short time before. Mowbray denies all these charges, although he does so in rather ambivalent terms. For instance, he acknowledges that he was aware of the scheme to kill Gloucester, and that he once laid an unsuccessful plot to kill the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, but he denies actual responsibilities for Gloucester's death, and says he has repented all his bad intentions. Mowbray and Bolingbroke insult each other in increasingly angry, heated, and creative terms. As Richard says of them, Mowbray and Bolingbroke call each other liars and traitors, and eventually throw down their gauges at each other's feet, challenging one another through a traditional chivalric duel in order to settle the accusations. King Richard, with the help of Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, tries to convince the two to reconcile, but they both refuse as a point of honor. So Richard sets a date for the two to have a formal traditional duel in order to settle the challenge. Act 1, Scene 2. While the court is waiting for Bolingbroke and Mowbray to settle their mutual accusations of treason in the lists, John of Gaunt, Bolingbroke's father, has a visit from his sister-in-law, the old Duchess of Gloucester. The Duchess is the widow of Gaunt's murdered brother, Thomas of Gloucester, and she has an axe to grind about Gloucester's death. She urges Gaunt to take revenge for his brother's death out of family loyalty and a sense of justice. He also ought to act, she says, because if Gaunt lets the murder go unavenged, he will be indicating that he himself is an easy target for political assassination. Gaunt, however, refuses to take action, saying that the two of them must leave the punishment of the murderers up to God. We also learn an important secret that Shakespeare's audiences already knew, and which looms large behind the action of Act 1, Scene 1, and in fact behind the entire play. The reason Gaunt cannot take action against Gloucester's murderers is that King Richard himself is widely known to have been involved in the conspiracy to kill his uncle. Gaunt refuses to rise against Richard, not out of fear of the king's power, but because Gaunt believes that the King of England has been appointed by God. Treason against the king would therefore be blasphemy against God, and those wronged by the king must leave it up to God to wreak vengeance. The Duchess, disappointed, bids Gaunt farewell as he departs to watch Bolingbroke and Mowbray fight it out in the lists. She curses both the younger nobleman, who she believes both had a part in the death of her husband, Gloucester, and she prays that both parties will die in their fights. Finally, as Gaunt leaves, she asks him to send her greetings to his brother, Edmund, Duke of York, and to ask York to visit her at Plassey, her home near London. Act 1, Scene 3. At Coventry, the two challengers, Bolingbroke and Mowbray, enter fully armed into the lists or their field of ritual combat. Bolingbroke is the accuser or appellant and Mowbray the defendant. Aided by the traditional officer of the duel, King Richard formally questions them both and has them repeat their accusations against one another. Both Bolingbroke and Mowbray make dramatic speeches restating their own innocence, the criminality of their opponent, their joy in the fight and their certainty of victory. John of Gaunt blesses his son Bolingbroke, and King Richard wishes good luck to both. Heralds and trumpets announce the fight's beginning, but then King Richard interrupts it before either can raise a weapon, by ritually throwing down his warder and ordering the duel to stop. After consulting with his advisors, King Richard returns and decrees a sentence of banishment upon both noblemen. Bolingbroke is banished from England, not to return for 10 years. Mowbray is banished for life. Both lament their sentences, but to no avail. Richard refuses to alter their punishment. Mowbray departs in grief, but Richard suddenly decides to reduce Bolingbroke's span of exile from 10 to 6 years, saying that he takes pity upon his saddened uncle, Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt. Gaunt thanks the king, but notes that he is so old that he will be dead before his son returns. Whether the sentence is 10 years or 6, After the king departs, Bolingbroke continues to lament his exile, in anger and unhappiness. His father counsels him to be philosophical and bear it like a man, imagining that he has banished the king and not the king him. After Bolingbroke has been banished from England, King Richard returns from Coventry to his court, accompanied by two of his friends and allies, the noblemen Bagot and Green. King Richard's cousin, the Duke of Aumale, has just returned from escorting Bolingbroke down to the sea, where the latter has taken ship for Europe. When asked how the two parted, Aumale reports that although Bolingbroke bade him farewell, he himself was cool to Bolingbroke and was glad to see him on his way. Richard then begins to muse, describing in great detail to his allies what he and another nobleman, Bushy, saw when they watched Bolingbroke leaving London. They beheld his courtship to the common people. The commoners love Bolingbroke. He is courteous and friendly to them, and a popular favorite of the lower classes of London. Richard feels that Bolingbroke was behaving as if he were in line to be the next king of England. Clearly afraid of Bolingbroke's popularity among the people, Richard expresses to his friends an ominous doubt that Bolingbroke will ever return to England again. Green reminds Richard that now that Bolingbroke is gone, there is other work to be done. There are rebels against the crown in Ireland, and the king must act quickly to suppress them, for they grow stronger with time. Richard announces that he will himself sail to Ireland to supervise the war there. But due to the cost of maintaining a court bloated with attendants and the king's wasteful spending habits, the royal treasury is low on funds. To raise money to pay for the Irish war, Richard is going to rent out the realm of England. That is, he is going to engage in some complicated methods of medieval taxation. He plans both to demand money from the wealthy and to borrow large sums of money from the wealthy people in exchange for later giving them cut of the royal taxes that come from the commoners. But she suddenly enters with important news. Old John of Gaunt, the uncle of the king and the father of Bolingbroke, lies on his deathbed. Richard rejoices to hear the information, saying that as soon as Gaunt is dead, he plans to seize his money and property in order to fund the war in Ireland. Everyone then heads off to visit John of Gaunt at the castle of the Bishop of Ely, where he lies dying. Act 2. Scene 1. John of Gaunt, ill and dying in his house, talks with the Duke of York while he awaits the arrival of King Richard. Gaunt hopes that with his dying breath he'll be able to give the foolhardy young King Richard some advice that he will listen to. York says that is unlikely. The king is too much surrounded by flatterers and too interested in the follies of fashion of the world. Gaunt replies that if that is the case, he must prophesy with his last breath that Richard is headed for doom. He goes on to lament in the play's most famous speech that the beautiful, fertile, and divinely favored country of England has been rented out. King Richard arrives with a large train of followers, Queen Isabel, O'Merle, Bushy, Bagot, Greeny, and more. When Richard inquires casually after Gaunt's health, Gaunt bitterly rebukes Richard for the exile of his son Bolingbroke. He then goes on to admonish Richard in scolding terms for the ways in which he has been wasting money, taxing the people too heavily, allowing the country to go to ruin, and letting himself to be flattered by his power-hungry and self-interested advisers. Richard, completely infuriated, interrupts his uncle, saying that they were Gaunt not of the royal blood. He would destroy him, but Gaunt, raging and made bold by the knowledge that he is dying away, points out to Richard that he has not hesitated to shed the blood of royalty before, and brings up the king's involvement in the death of his uncle Thomas of Gloucester. He finishes by cursing Richard with his dying breath and walking out on the king. York tries to make excuses for Gaunt's behavior to Richard, but Richard, understandably enough, is not in a very good mood. The Earl of Northumberland comes in to tell the company that Gaunt has died. Richard promptly announces his intention to seize all of Gaunt's worldly goods in order to finance his war in Ireland. His uncle, the Duke of York, protests vehemently, pointing out that Gaunt was a loyal subject and that his estate should be rights now belong to his son Bolingbroke, who, though currently in exile, will eventually return to England to claim it. But Richard would not listen to him, and York departs. Richard, blithely ignoring his powerful uncle's distress and concern, tells his allies that tomorrow he plans to set sail for Ireland, and that he will make his York Lord Governor of England while he himself is gone. After Richard leaves with his attendants, 3 lords, the Earl of Northumberland, Lord Ross, and Lord Willoughby, remain behind. Indignant at Richard's latest injustice, the 3 agree that England is being ruined under Richard's reign. Northumberland confides to the other 2 that he has secret news. Bolingbroke, with many English allies and with ships supplied by the King of Brittany, plans to sail for England as soon as Richard leaves for Ireland. Their plan is to invade England's northeast shore and stage a royal coup. The 3 decide to join him, and they depart together for Ravensworth in the north, where Bolingbroke plans to land. Act 2, Scene 2. King Richard has departed for Ireland to put down the rebels there. Back at Windsor Castle, near London, Queen Isabel mourns his absence. Bushy and Bagot, loyal advisors of the king, try to comfort her, but Isabel says she's haunted by foreboding and despair. She feels as though something terrible is going to happen. Greeny enters to give them all bad news. Henry Bolingbroke has landed with his army at Ravensbourne, on the northeast coast of England. Unfortunately, Richard has already departed for Ireland and taken his army with him, so there is no one to stop him. Moreover, many English lords have defected from Richard and joined Bolingbroke. The Duke of York then enters, obviously upset. He has been left in charge of the government while Richard is away, but a combination of stress, old age, and a moral dilemma as to whether he ought to be supporting Richard or Bolingbroke has left him uncertain of what to do. We learn that his son, O'Malley, has already left to join Richard in Ireland. Moreover, when York sends a servant to ask for financial assistance from his sister-in-law, the Duchess of Gloucester, he discovers that she has died earlier that day, unable to figure out how to raise money to repel Bolingbroke's attack. York departs to go to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire to try to raise an army. He takes Queen Isabel with him. Left alone, Bushy, Bagot, and Greeny consult with each other. They all agree that they are now in danger. Raising an army large enough to deflect Bolingbroke in the absence of the king seems impossible. As known favorites of Richard, they are now in danger from the common people who have turned against Richard and his supporters. All three decide to flee Windsor. Bushy and Greeny decide to go to Bristol Castle, while Bagot declares his intention to join Richard in Ireland. They bid each other farewell, troubled by the possibility that they may never meet again. Act 2, Scenes 3 and 4. In the wild highlands of Gloucestershire, in the south-central England, we find Henry Bolingbroke and Lord Northumberland riding toward Berkeley Castle, where they intend to meet up with the Lord Ross and Lord Willoughby. The two have had a long journey from Ravensbourne in the northeast, where Bolingbroke landed, but Northumberland says the trip has not been difficult. They are met unexpectedly by Northumberland's young son, Harry Percy. From him, they learn that we, as readers, already know that Northumberland's brother, the Earl of Worcester, has left Richard's court to join Bolingbroke. Percy also tells them that Northumberland and the other defectors have been declared traitors, and that Percy himself was sent by Worcester to scout out Berkeley Castle and learn what sort of army York is raising there. Northumberland introduces Bolingbroke to his young son. Percy swears allegiance to him, and Bolingbroke swears eternal friendship and gratitude to Percy. The party turns out to already be very near Berkeley Castle, and we learn from Percy that York's army is small, only 300 men, and has very few noblemen in it. Lord Ross and Lord Willoughby arrive on horseback to join Bolingbroke, and then the Duke of York himself emerges from the castle. Bolingbroke makes an eloquent speech, declaring that Richard has done him wrong, pleading his right to the titles denied him, and arguing that he is unable to seek redress any other way. York, clearly moved, explains that, regardless of his own feeling about the matter, he cannot condone a rebellion against the lawful king. However, he also concedes that he does not presently have the manpower to repel Bolingbroke and his allies, and declares that he will thus remain completely neutral on the matter. Bolingbroke and his allies are invited to spend the night in Berkeley Castle. Bolingbroke accepts, and he attempts to persuade his uncle to come with him the next day to Bristol Castle, where he intends to find and destroy Bushy and Bagot. Meanwhile, there's bad news waiting for Richard in Wales. On the coast of Wales, where Richard intends to land upon his return from Ireland, a large Welsh army has been waiting, under the supervision of Richard's ally, Lord Salisbury, for Richard to lead it against Bolingbroke when he returns. After 10 days of waiting with no news from the king, the army's Welsh captain explains to Salisbury that there are bad omens in the surrounding landscape and in the sky, and that he and his men are convinced Richard is dead. The Welshmen then begin to disperse despite Salisbury's pleas for them to remain. In despair, he declares that he can see Richard's star falling, like one of the Welshmen's bad omens, from the sky down towards the earth. Act 3. At Bristol Castle, in southern England, a short distance south of Berkeley Castle, Henry Bolingbroke and his men have apprehended Bushy and Grinny, who remain loyal to King Richard. Bolingbroke accuses them of having misled a prince, that is, of having given Richard deliberately bad advice, and recites a list of charges against them. He says that they have stirred up trouble between the king and his queen, and that their advice was the reason that Richard misinterpreted Bolingbroke and subsequently banished him. He thus condemns them to be executed. Bushy and Grinny are defiant but resigned. Northumberland leads them away to die. Having dispatched this piece of business, Bolingbroke sends greetings to the Queen Isabel via the Duke of York, at whose house she is staying, and gathers up his men to fight some rebellious Welsh before heading to the main battle. Meanwhile, King Richard has landed on the coast of Wales, accompanied by the Duke of O'Malley, the Bishop of Carlisle, and some soldiers. Richard greets the earth and air of England in poetic terms. O'Malley points out that, while they delay, Bolingbroke grows stronger in power. Richard responds in powerful language that, since he is the rightful king, no rebel stands a chance. God is on their side, and they will easily sweep Bolingbroke out of England. Lord Salisbury enters, and, grieving, delivers terrible news to Richard. Only the day before, the army of 12,000 men of Wales, believing Richard to be dead, dispersed from where they had been waiting for him and fled to Bolingbroke. Richard is now without an army. Richard momentarily succumbs to despair, but then recovers his loyal self-assurance. Lord Scrope then enters to give Richard the news that, as Bolingbroke made his way through England, all the common people acknowledged him as lord and joined his forces, men, women, and children alike. Richard asks Scrope what has happened to his allies Bagot, Bushy, Grinny, and the Earl of Wiltshire. Scrope tells him that they have made peace with Bolingbroke. Richard curses and damns them in ferocious terms, but then Scrope explains that he means that they have been executed. Richard gives a long, eloquent, and despairing monologue, but the Bishop of Carlisle tells him to recover hope. Giving in the fear of despair, he says, will do the enemy's work for him. Richard agrees and declares that he will ride against Bolingbroke despite his losses. But Scrope has yet more bad news. The Duke of York has defected to Bolingbroke too, and all the king's castles in the north and his allies in the south are in Bolingbroke's possession or on his side. Richard, hearing this and realizing that he has no hope left, announces his final intention to give in to despair and declares that he will go to Flint Castle in northeastern Wales to pine away. Scene 3. Bolingbroke, along with the Duke of York, Lord Northumberland, and their attendants, rides toward Flint Castle, to which King Richard has fled. York, although he has now joined forces with Bolingbroke, is deeply disturbed about the possibility of divine retribution for the impending overthrow of the king, and Bolingbroke acknowledges his concerns. Young Harry Percy brings the party the news that King Richard is holed up inside the castle with several allies. O'Malley, Lord Salisbury, Sir Stephen Screw, and the Bishop of Carlisle. Bolingbroke sends Northumberland to Richard with a message that he, Bolingbroke, has come as a loyal subject to his king and is prepared to surrender his army if the lands and title which Richard seized for John of Gaunt at his death are returned to Bolingbroke, who is Gaunt's rightful heir. Otherwise, Bolingbroke will wage war against the king. However, before Northumberland can enter the castle, King Richard and his allies appear upon the high walls of the castle. Richard proudly, with all the authority of a king, thunderingly tells Northumberland to relay a message to Bolingbroke. If Bolingbroke dares try to usurp the throne, the heavens and the king will rain vengeance upon him. He also says that Bolingbroke will not possess the crown in peace until the fields of England have been stained with blood. Bolingbroke quickly denies that he has come to seize the throne, claiming that he is there simply to demand that his rights as Gaunt's heir be restored to him. Richard agrees to Bolingbroke's demands, but he realizes, as he says, in highly dramatic and despairing language to his attendants, that his reign as king has ended. Bolingbroke will certainly not let him retain the crown. Bolingbroke calls upon Richard to come down from the castle and parley with him, and Richard and his attendants obediently descend. Bolingbroke never says aloud that his intention is to take the crown, but Richard asks whether he must go with Bolingbroke and his army to London, and Bolingbroke says yes. Richard, saying that it is clear he has no choice, agrees. Scene 4. While Richard, Bolingbroke, and their respective allies have been having their fateful encounters in the west of England and in Wales, Queen Isabel has been staying at the house of the Duke of York. Although she has not yet heard the news of Richard's capture by Bolingbroke, sadness and foreboding weigh very heavily upon her. As she walks in the Duke's garden with her waiting woman, they try to cheer her up by suggesting of games, singing, dancing, and storytelling. The Queen rejects all these ideas, saying that making any attempt to forget her grief would only add to it. An aged gardener and his assistant enter the garden to tend to some of the plants. At the Queen's suggestion, she and her ladies conceal themselves in the shadow of a grove to overhear what the men will discuss. She has noticed that the common folk have been discussing affairs of state, as if expecting an imminent change in the government. The older gardener tells his assistant to bind an apricot tree against a wall, and the two then begin to talk about the state of the country, using the garden as a metaphor. Why, the assistant asks, should the two of them bother to maintain order within their garden, when the country surrounding it has been allowed to sprout weeds and be infested by insects? The elder gardener tells him to keep quiet, since the person who caused the country's disorder has met with the fall of leaf. That is, King Richard has been overthrown. He informs the assistant that letters came last night to a friend of the Duke of York's bearing the news that the king's allies are dead and that King Richard himself has been captured by Bolingbroke. It seems almost certain that the king will soon be removed from power. Queen Isabel, no longer able to contain herself, bursts from her hiding place to ask the gardener if what he says is true. The gardener apologetically confirms that it is. King Richard is in Bolingbroke's custody, and in comparing the resources of the two sides, it has become apparent while Richard has nothing left. Bolingbroke holds the loyalty of all the English noblemen. He adds that if Isabel will go to London, she'll discover that what he says is true. Isabel, lamenting her misfortune and the sorrow that lies in her future, summons her ladies to come with her to London, to meet the captured Richard. She casts upon the gardener a half-hearted, grief-stricken curse as she departs. But the good-natured gardener takes pity upon the queen instead of getting angry. He decides to plant a bed of rue, the herb of sorrow, in the place where he saw her tears fall. Act 4. Scene 1. Henry Bolingbroke, his allies, and the captured party of King Richard have returned from Wales to London. There, in Westminster Hall, they call on Bagot to give testimony, asking him who conspired with Richard to kill Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. Bagot claims that the Duke of Aumale was central in the conspiracy. Aumale heatedly denies it, setting off a gouge-throwing chain reaction which eventually involves 6 people. Aumale begins by declaring that Bagot is a liar and throwing down his gage to challenge him to single combat. Immediately thereafter, Lord Fitzwater, Lord Percy, and another unnamed lord all throw down gauges against Aumale. Then Lord Surrey throws down his gage in Aumale's side, and the trigger-happy Fitzwater throws down his gage again. And Aumale, who is out of gauges, is forced to borrow someone else's so that he, too, can throw down his gauge again. As the gauge-throwing rose to ludicrous proportions, Bolingbroke cuts them all off, saying that the challenges will have to wait. He plans to bring Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, back from the exile to which Richard condemned him, and Mowbray will help settle the truth of the matter. However, the Bishop of Carlisle tells them all that Mowbray has died while fighting valiantly in the Crusades. The Duke of York abruptly enters to inform the company that King Richard has capitulated, agreeing to adopt Bolingbroke as his heir and to yield the throne to him immediately. Bolingbroke agrees, but the Bishop of Carlisle interrupts him, breaking into a long speech in which he condemns Bolingbroke for his insurrection against the rightful king. He tells Bolingbroke that if he takes the crown now from the true King of England, generations yet to come will suffer and the ground will be soaked in English blood. Northumberland promptly arrests Carlisle on charges of high treason. Bolingbroke summons Richard so that he may abdicate the crown to him in full view of the nobles. Helpless and despairing, Richard enters. He delays giving Bolingbroke the crown with a long grief-stricken monologue in which he surrenders land, crown, and kingship. Northumberland asks him to read aloud a statement confessing his crimes against the kingdom so that people may deem that you are worthily deposed. But Richard resists the order. He then calls for a looking-glass, and after staring into it and wondering aloud about his own identity, now that he is no longer king, he dashes it to the floor. Richard asks Bolingbroke one final favor, that he be allowed to go away, freely from the court. Bolingbroke, without explicitly answering no, comments that Richard be taken to the Tower of London. Richard departs under guard. Bolingbroke sets the date of his coronation as the following Wednesday. After he leaves, the Bishop of Carlisle, the Abbot of Westminster, and O'Malley begin to speak together, apparently conspiring against Bolingbroke. Act 5. Queen Isabel and her attendants has arrived in London, where they have stationed themselves on a street leading to the Tower of London, so that they may meet the deposed King Richard when he passes by on his way to the Tower. Richard and his guard ride into view, and Isabel laments to see her lord so changed. Richard sees her and tries to comfort her, telling her she must now learn to live with grief. He bids her imagine that her life has always been as it is now, tells her to think about the afterlife instead of this one, and instructs her to return to France and enter a religious convent. Isabel, angry and despairing, asks Richard what has happened to his courage and righteous indignation. Has Bolingbroke taken that from him, as well as his crown? Richard replies that it is no longer of any use to try to fight. His fate is settled, and Isabel should think of him as dead. He orders her again to go to France, and asks her to tell his tragic tale as a fireside story on long winter evenings, a tale to make its hearers weep. Northumberland enters and tells Richard that Bolingbroke has changed his mind about what is to be done with him. Richard is not to go to the Tower of London, but is instead to be taken to Pomfret Castle in the north of England. Richard tells him in something that sounds half like a curse, half like an ominous prophecy, that the peace between him and Bolingbroke will not last long. Northumberland and the new king will be at each other's throats soon enough. Northumberland replies curtly and orders him to take leave of Isabel. She is to be sent back to France immediately, and he must go to Pomfret. Richard and Isabel bid each other a long, touching farewell in highly stylized language, and part to go their separate ways. Scenes 2 and 3. At the Duke of York's house at Langley, the aged Duke greets his wife, the Duchess of York, and tells her about the long day he has had. When Bolingbroke rode into London in triumph for his coronation, leading Richard in captivity, the people scowled upon Richard and dumped rubbish onto his head, but cheered wildly for Bolingbroke. Throwing open the windows to watch him pass, they cried out, York is upset by the bad treatment given to the former King Richard, but he vows to be loyal to the new king. O'Malley, the son of the Duke and Duchess of York, enters. He is now called Rutland, apparently having lost his more noble title due to Bolingbroke's judgment on the trial, as he listlessly discusses the triumphal celebrations being held at Oxford in honor of the new king, Henry IV. His father, York, notices a letter that he is concealing within his shirt. O'Malley tries to prevent his father from seeing it, but York seizes and reads it. He immediately becomes highly agitated, calling his son villain, traitor, slave. The letter, it turns out, reveals that O'Malley has joined in a conspiracy of a dozen noblemen who plan to assassinate King Henry at Oxford. The Duchess tries to reason with York, pleading with him to keep O'Malley's involvement a secret, since he is their only son and she is too old to bear more children. York, however, will not listen, and he mounts his horse to ride the King Henry and tell him everything. The Duchess instructs O'Malley to ride after his father and try to reach the king first to beg his forgiveness. She herself will follow as swiftly as she can, so that she can plead for O'Malley's life. At Windsor Castle, near London, we find Bolingbroke complaining to young Harry Percy about the wild ways of Bolingbroke's son, whom he has not seen for a full 3 months. The young prince has apparently been spending his time in taverns and whorehouses and associating with robbers and highwaymen. Bolingbroke is concerned, but still sees signs of hope in the boy. O'Malley enters and begs his cousin Bolingbroke for a private audience. The new king dismisses his companions, and O'Malley falls to his knees and says he will not rise until the king has agreed to forgive him for the crime he has committed, nor will he name the crime until he has the king's pardon. He also begs the king to lock the door until their conference is done. Bolingbroke complies, but suddenly the Duke of York is heard banging at the door. He cries out that O'Malley is a traitor. Bolingbroke draws his sword, but O'Malley swears that the king has nothing to fear from him. York then enters and shows Bolingbroke the traitorous letter. The voice of the Duchess is heard from outside, and she, too, enters the chamber. She has ridden from her home to plead with the king to spare her son's life. A strange three-way conversation in highly formal language ensues between the Duchess of York, the Duke of York, and the king. York pleads with the king to execute his son as a traitor, while the Duchess begs him to spare O'Malley's life. At last, the king decides to pardon O'Malley, but adds that all the rest of the conspirators will be arrested and executed immediately. Scenes 4 to 6. In Windsor Castle, where the new King Henry IV now resides, a nobleman called Sir Piers Exton is talking with his servants. He tells them that King Henry has asked his audience of courtiers. Exton reasonably interprets the living figure as a reference to the still living King Richard, who is currently imprisoned at Pomfret Castle in the north of England. Exton thinks that he saw King Henry specifically look at him when he asks the question. He decides that as the king's friend, motivated either by loyalty or by hope of reward, or perhaps both, he will be the man to go and kill Richard. Richard is still trying to come to terms with his isolation from the world. He tries various metaphorical and metaphysical tricks to convince himself that he is not alone, but is still part of a populated world. A groom who has remained faithful to Richard comes in unexpectedly to reach Richard well and tell him how grieved he is to behold the former king's fall, but he cannot cheer the grieving king. Then the castle's keeper enters with food for the former king. Richard, worried, bids the keeper taste of it first, as he usually does. But the keeper says that he cannot. One Sir Piers of Exton, who has come to see him, has forbidden it. Angrily, Richard strikes the keeper, who cries out. Exton and his accomplices rush in. After a brief scuffle in which Richard apparently kills several of the accomplices, Exton succeeds in striking him down, and Richard, condemning Exton to burn in hell for his sin, dies. Troubled by doubt and guilt, Exton resolves to bury his slain accomplices at Pomfret and convey Richard's body to King Henry at Windsor. At Windsor, Bolingbroke is discussing the state of affairs with his advisors. The bad news is that they are rebels setting fire to towns in Gloucestershire in the northwest. But the good news is that the main conspirators against Henry's life, Lord Salisbury, the Abbot of Westminster, and others, have been executed and their heads sent to London. The Bishop of Carlisle has been left alive and is now presented to the king for his sentence. Bolingbroke shows the bishop mercy and commands him to find a secret place, keep a low profile, and live out his life in peace. Suddenly, Exton enters with the coffin containing Richard's body and tells Bolingbroke that he has taken the cue from his own mouth and murdered the former king. Bolingbroke, in some of the most highly loaded, double-edged, and ambiguous language in the play, says that while he admits he is very glad that Richard is dead, he denies that he actually ordered the former king's murder and declares that he now loathes and repudiates Exton. He orders Exton to leave the court and wander miserably in his guilt. Bolingbroke himself vows to take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, to wash the guilt of this murder from his soul. He orders a sad funeral for Richard, and he and his retinue depart the stage in mourning. Character analysis. King Richard II. Richard II is King of England, John of Gaunt's nephew and Bolingbroke's cousin. Authoritarian, unwilling to listen to good advice, friendly with persons not of noble birth, he is not the sort of king likely to earn his nobleman's love. He overtaxes the country, finding many new ways of raising revenue, most of which appears to be wasted. Richard most likely had some part in his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester's death, and is worried that this will come to light. He believes strongly in the divine right of kings, and when misfortune comes upon him, he often compares himself to Jesus. He is nevertheless insecure enough that when faced with utter rebellion, he gives up his throne to his cousin without ever being directly asked to do so. Needing money to fight a war in Ireland, he is foolish enough to confiscate the wealth and the recently deceased Gaunt, not heeding his uncle York's warnings that this will undermine his own right to the throne. Absent from England for a day too long, he is left bereft of friends and quite unable to fight off Bolingbroke's rebellion. With no option but to give up the crown, he still manages to completely upstage his cousin while officially relinquishing the state to him. He grows contemplative in prison. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, is Richard's uncle, Bolingbroke's father, and probably the most respected man in the kingdom. He is deeply loyal, both to the king and to his country, and is broken-hearted that the one is betraying the other. Like Richard II, he firmly believes in the divine right of kings, and he, at first, refuses to confront Richard for Gloucester's murder, on religious grounds. Gaunt cares deeply for his son, as upon Henry's banishment, Gaunt becomes deathly ill. On his deathbed, he speaks openly and honestly with Richard, criticizing the king for leasing out a royal lands and deciding that Richard is no longer above the law. On his deathbed, he speaks openly and honestly with Richard, criticizing the king for leasing out royal lands and deciding that Richard is no longer above the law as king. Gaunt dies very early on in the play, allowing Richard to seize his lands and disinherit Henry Bolingbroke. The Duke of York is Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt's younger brother. When the latter dies, he is left the last living son of Edward III. Like Gaunt, the Duke of York is loyal to Richard, even though he sympathizes with Henry and urges the king not to disinherit him. When Richard leaves for England, he leaves the Duke of York in charge of the country. But York, after scolding Henry for breaking the king's mandate of exile, surrenders almost immediately to Henry's forces and ultimately joins with the usurper. an old, easily confused, and rather doddering old man. He is named Regent of England by Richard despite his manifest lack of ability for the role. Kindly and well-intentioned, he is desperate to do the right thing. He regrets what he's done to Richard, but once he has sworn fealty to Bolingbroke as king, he is firm in his loyalty, even to denouncing his son orally at the risk of his life. He is not the most patient of husbands. Henry Bolingbroke. While Richard II is the story of Richard's downfall, it is also the story of Henry Bolingbroke's rise to the throne as Henry IV. Henry is Richard's cousin and the son of John of Gaunt. From the very start of the play, Henry makes it clear that he is willing to die for his honor. As opposed to Richard, who is an eloquent speaker, Henry is a man of action, and throughout the play he suggests that subjects have the power to make demands on their rulers, if the rulers are not properly serving the people and the nation. Henry is extremely popular with the common people, and his transition into power goes very smoothly, though the effect of usurping the king will bedevil his own reign later on. Once crowned, Henry shows mercy, pardoning a few men who stood against him because of their honor, but he also hints to a servant that Richard should be executed. He also learned briefly in the play that Henry is disappointed with his eldest son, Hal. On to theme analysis. The Throne. This set of plays depicts the historic struggles for the English throne, and along with Shakespeare's other tetralogy, the changes of power that eventually led to the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, the monarch of England, during the first part of Shakespeare's career. The play begins with Richard firmly in power, presiding over a disagreement between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, who both praised their king as a legitimate sovereign and liege. Richard's power and status of king come from his sacred blood. The sacred aspect of his blood is meant literally here. This line of thinking suggests that kings rule by divine right, meaning that they are chosen and supported by God. The reference to sacred blood also indicates that the way that Richard receives God's endorsement for the throne. Royalty and divine right are inherited. Richard was crowned king when his grandfather, Edward III, died. It is literally his blood and his family line that place him on the throne. Though there are disputes throughout the history plays about the ways to properly trace inheritance and royal bloodlines, it is generally accepted that the children of kings inherit the throne. However, when John of Gaunt dies, Richard seizes his assets and disinherits Henry Bolingbroke, robbing him of his inheritance in order to fund a war with Ireland. This action disillusions those closest to Richard and touches upon the primary question raised by the play: how should a king rule? Family. At the center of Richard II, as in many other Shakespeare plays, is a family drama. Many characters are related to one another, and family obligations are constantly pitted against religious and moral duties. However, as is also common in Shakespeare, the family drama is elevated to a royal family drama, raising the stakes of the domestic conflict. One's obligation to King Richard can be doubled. For example, if one is both a subject of a cousin to the king, these raised stakes lead to political motivation, which in turn cause people to act towards their families in ways they otherwise might not. Honor. From the beginning of Richard II, honor, and particularly the appearance of honor, is the utmost importance to the characters in the play. The dispute between Henry and Mowbray that opens the play, for example, is essentially one of honor. In the dispute, Henry and Mowbray stand before Richard and call each other traitors. Being a traitor is, of course, extremely dishonorable, and it is this attacking honor and his spotless reputation that makes Henry's accusation so infuriating to Mowbray. About the author. So William Shakespeare was born in 1564 and died in 1616 in Stratford-upon-Avon. He is often called England's national poet and is considered the greatest dramatist of all time. His works are loved throughout the world, but Shakespeare's personal life is shrouded in mystery. He was an English poet, playwright, and actor of the Renaissance era. He was an important member of the King's Men Company of theatrical players from roughly 1594 onward. Known throughout the world, Shakespeare's writings capture the range of human emotion and conflict and have been celebrated for more than 400 years. And yet, the personal life of William Shakespeare is somewhat a mystery. There are two primary sources that provide historians with an outline of his life. One is his work, the plays, poems, and sonnets, and the other is official documentation such as church and court records. However, these provide only brief sketches of specific events in his life and yield little insight into the man himself. No birth records exist, but an old church record indicates that a William Shakespeare was baptized at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon on April 26, 1564. From this, it is believed he was born on or near April 23rd, and this is the date scholars acknowledge as William Shakespeare's birthday. Located about 100 miles northwest of London during Shakespeare's time, Stratford-upon-Avon was a bustling market town bisected with a country road and the River Avon. Scant records exist of William's childhood, and virtually none regarding his education. Scholars have summarized that he most likely attended the King's New School in Stratford, which taught reading, writing, and the classics. Being a public official's child, William would have undoubtedly qualified for free tuition. But this uncertainty regarding his education has led some to raise questions about the authorship of his work. William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway on November 28, 1582, in Worcester. Hathaway was from Shottery, a small village a mile west of Stratford. William was 18 and Anne was 26, and as it turns out, pregnant. Their first child, a daughter, they named Susanna, was born in May 26, 1583. 2 years later, on February 2, 1585, twins Hamnet and Judith were born. Hamnet later died of unknown causes at age 11. By the early 1590s, documents show William Shakespeare was a managing partner in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, an acting company in London with which he was connected for most of his career. Considered the most important troupe of its time, the company changed its name to the King's Men following the crown of King James I in 1603. From all accounts, the King's Men Company was very popular. Records show that Shakespeare had works published and sold as popular literature. Although the theater culture in the 16th century England was not highly admired by people of high rank, some of the nobility were good patrons of the performing arts and friends of the actors. By 1599, William Shakespeare and his business partners built their own theatre on the south bank of the Thames River, which they called the Globe Theatre. In 1605, Shakespeare purchased leases of real estate near Stratford for £440, which doubled in value and earned him £60 a year. This made him an entrepreneur as well as an artist, and scholars believe these investments gave him the time to write his plays uninterrupted. William Shakespeare's early plays were written in the conventional style of the day, with elaborate metaphors and rhetorical phrases that didn't always align naturally with the story's plot or characters. However, Shakespeare was very innovative, adapting the traditional style to his own purposes and creating a freer flow of words, with only small degrees of variation. Shakespeare primarily used a metrical pattern consisting of lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter or blank verse to compose his plays. At the same time, there are passages in all the plays that deviate from this and use forms of poetry or simple prose. So that's it for this video. If you found it useful, give it a thumbs up and do subscribe to our channel where we offer free materials to help you get a really better grasp of areas you might find challenging. And make sure to visit our website where we offer model answers, revision guides, and tools to help you with your exams. Thank you for listening.